as we spend the next few days reimagining professionalism together, I'm going to kick us off by discussing how some of the tensions in our training environments might help us better understand which aspects of professionalism need to be reconsidered and which are worth forever holding on to. Medical education, as I realized when I wrote about it and put together a 10-episode podcast season, turns out to be a really fraught topic. And I think that's because when we're talking about medical education, we're actually talking about so much else. We're talking about how we find meaning in our lives, how culture shapes our belief systems, and what it even means to be a doctor today. So I realize that some of you here might not agree with some of what I said or what I'm about to say, and I totally understand that. If I had one fundamental ambition when I took on this topic, it was to start an open-hearted and respectful conversation. And so getting to be part of your conversation really means the world to me. So how did this all begin? I think there were probably a million different moments, but the one I remember most was in the spring of 2022. I was scrolling through Twitter, as I once did back in the day, and I noticed a debate that pops up every now and then about whether medicine is a job or a calling. I'm not sure I ever have found the debate that interesting because I really think that how you treat your work is a personal decision, meaning there's no right answer. But what I found super interesting and novel was how enraged many trainees seemed to be when someone would argue that medicine was a calling. That seemed new to me and like something that we ought to be paying attention to. And I wondered why. So I started talking to trainees, lots of them, and I'm going to talk a bit about one in particular, Austin Witt, because I think he articulated so clearly the perspective of many trainees, and more specifically, why referring to medicine as a calling had become so offensive to some. So Witt recently completed his family medicine residency at an urban medical center, but he grew up in a rural town called Oliver Spring, Tennessee. And as a child, Witt became very aware of the mistreatment of the American worker. He watched his coal mining relatives endure occupational hazards such as mesothelioma. He saw that they were afraid to seek better working conditions because of past retribution against their coworkers. And he observed large corporations coming and going with little concern for the impoverished communities that they left behind. So even though Witt chose a different career path than his coal mining ancestors, he felt no more likely than they were to describe his own job as a calling. That term, Witt told me, is weaponized against trainees as a means of subjugation, a way to force them to accept poor working conditions. So Witt's perspective obviously raised a ton of questions for me that I spent the next year and a half trying to answer. But before addressing those questions, I want to deal with the kids these days fallacy head on. So basically, as some of you, I realize, know, since humans have inhabited the earth, it's been the norm for the older generation to see the younger generation as inferior, less well-read, less hardworking, less attuned to the complexities of the world, even when none of these observed deficiencies are true. And I can tell you that this potential bias plagued me when I was writing. Also made me feel very old. That's a whole other issue. But so I do want to say two things about it. The first is that it's so obvious to me that the students and trainees entering medicine today are as gifted and talented, if not more so, than those of us in previous generations. When I sit on the admissions whatever it's called, committee group that vets cardiology applicants, I start to feel extremely sick to my stomach every time we go to generate a rank list because I can't imagine how I ever got a fellowship, much less a job. But the other thing I want to say about the fallacy is if you take it to its logical conclusion, it becomes impossible to talk about generational change. And that's really not that helpful either. Generations change, technologies have changed, and medicine has changed. So yes, the kids these days bias may color our perceptions, but also yes, you'd have to be living under a rock to not observe that massive generational change is underway. So with that said, I want to return to this question about the reason that trainees are perceiving that their working conditions are poor. So one widely voiced concern among trainees is that they don't spend their days in ways that feel educational. Many trainees, with the exception of those in procedural specialties, spend the bulk of their days not with patients, but at a computer engaged in activities they feel are geared more toward billing than toward patient care. And so they feel like cogs in a massive corporate wheel, a phrase that I heard so many times in the podcast that my editor made me start cutting it every time somebody said it, sadly. Trainees, obviously, though, aren't alone in perceiving this shift. I'm sure many of you in educational roles see it too, especially those of you who've been doing this a while, and I'd like to give a shout out to Joel Katz for helping me understand this evolution. So historically, the missions of trainees in hospitals were better aligned. Hospitals were invested in residents' education, and there was a shared commitment to serving vulnerable people. But today, most hospital boards and many leaders, even at so-called not-for-profit hospitals, increasingly prioritize financial success. So if trainees perceive that the hospitals view them as an inexpensive source of labor, that's often because it's true. And when you feel more like a corporate widget than like a budding doctor, the sacrifices you're making may start to feel less appealing. Sacrifice, though, is never just about what you give up. It's also about considering what you might gain. And in this sense, I think it's really important to discuss the erosion of what one program director described to me as the grand bargain. Historically, physicians knew that they'd devote themselves to this arduous and consuming training, but on the other side, they'd have this rewarding, privileged life. They'd get to do sacred work, have high wages, and be deeply respected by society. Now trainees look ahead and what do they see? They see a burned out workforce. They see PAs earning a comfortable income with way more flexible hours. And they see a society with far less reverence and a lot more skepticism toward medical professionals. All of these forces can make the sacrifices and the associated discomforts feel less worth it. So far, we've talked about what's happening within medicine, but I don't think any of our challenges can be understood without also thinking about what's going on beyond our walls. And one massive societal shift affecting all sectors, including medicine, is a growing rejection of the notion that work ought to be the center of our lives. The pandemic obviously heightened this skepticism, but the critique actually isn't new. Writing in The Atlantic in 2019, the journalist Derek Thompson, who's now best-selling co-author of the book Abundance, describes a century-long evolution in Americans' conceptualization of work from jobs to careers to callings, noting how this evolution coincided with our societal secularization, meaning many of us have turned away from traditional religious faith. Thompson argues that work, as it became the centerpiece of our identity and purpose, assumed its own sort of religiosity. And Thompson thinks this is very bad. So if you're anything like me, you may wonder, what's wrong with finding work, and especially medicine, sacred? But what Thompson argues, in a critique that resonates among many in medicine, and especially among trainees, is that the sanctification of work is bad because unlike traditional deities, work doesn't love you back. For both millennials and Gen Z, the so-called Zoomers, who have graduated often into unstable labor markets, the idea that work should be a source of meaning and identity resonates far less than it might have to those of us in previous generations. So to me, Thompson's critique raises the fundamental tension that we face as we balance this widespread sense of institutional betrayal with our commitment to educating the next generation. Medicine may seem morally corrupt, particularly to a generation highly attuned to capitalism's inherent injustices and broader systemic failures. But our patients may suffer even more if we respond to these institutional wrongs by relegating medicine to the margins of our lives. Being a doctor was once considered worthy of sacrifice because lives were at stake. The nature of our work has changed, but the stakes for our patients haven't. So why has it gotten so much harder to point out the primacy of patient care? In other words, can we even still say patients come first? To get at this question, I want to briefly return to Thompson's point about work becoming a source of sanctity for people, particularly as we as a culture became more secular. Because there's a subtler point within this observation, and I think it was best stated by the legendary writer David Foster Wallace in a commencement speech he gave at Kenyon College that I think says so much about what it means to be human. And what Wallace said is, quote, "There's no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship." In other words, we may not be worshiping God or work or medicine as much anymore, but what are we going to worship instead? So it's here I'm going to turn to an equally important cultural trend, and that is the pursuit of well-being as a near-Platonic ideal. To be clear, not everyone worships at the altar of well-being. We all know physicians and trainees, and I know for a fact, this is true, of many of you here in this audience, who give too much of yourselves. But it's also tough to exaggerate how much the pursuit of well-being and its close cousin self-care have permeated our culture. And medicine has hardly been immune, which I think is where things start to get tough in some of our educational environments, where once routine aspects of medical training are increasingly being perceived as anti-well-being. So I talked to a lot of people in my reporting and educational roles, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what some of them told me. So a department chair told me that encroachments on time away from the hospital, whether for reading or staying at home, for reading at home or staying after a shift to deal with evolving illness, are often now being cast as threats to mental health. A vice dean of education told me that students concerned about peer-to-peer comparisons had protested the existence of the AOA Society. And a similar sense of unfairness, I think, has also contributed to many institutions abandoning grades, which itself has had a host of unintended consequences that may be bad for well-being. And educators often described being admonished for giving medical students or trainees any negative feedback, and noted having been told to include only positive comments in the written record. Part of what's so hard for the many trainees who disagree with this evolving ethos is the social pressure that they face to conform. So Dr. A is a medical student that I interviewed who's now a resident, who told me about his own experience on his internal medicine clerkship. And while he was on the rotation, Dr. A dove into the tasks that medical students often undertake: getting outside records, faxing forms, updating patients' PCPs. But he sensed that some of his peers disapproved of his willingness to engage in such scut work. The other students, he told me, thought that the tasks weren't educational, and they told Dr. A that by leaning into them, instead of setting boundaries, he was reinforcing problematic norms about medical students. Dr. A disagreed. He saw the work as integral to both his education and patient care, but he found it difficult to challenge their perceptions. If you disagree with someone who's trying to set boundaries, Dr. A told me, you're seen as part of a toxic culture and not supporting people in their wellness. So because I said a lot, I'm going to pause for a second and just broadly summarize the three big forces converging in our training environments, and in turn, shaping our ideas about professionalism. For many trainees and some of those in practice, work feels less sacred. Across society, people are being told not to sanctify work in the first place, and in our hierarchy of cultural values, well-being, whatever that actually means, and I hope to get to it a little bit, has assumed its own sacred status. And so you can see why a lot of us have been left scratching our heads. No one wants to come out against well-being, except maybe me. But we are a profession meant to dedicate ourselves to the well-being of others. So why has it become so difficult to emphasize the importance of this other sacred mission. So one physician, I'll call her Dr. S, helped me understand the fear that many in educational roles, I think, feel speaking up. When Dr. S began her chief year about 8 years ago, she assumed she should model what people had admired in her when she was in training. Arriving early, staying late, being detail-oriented. But she sensed a cultural shift was underway. Suddenly, everyone was talking about wellness, self-care, work-life balance. The traits she'd nurtured were becoming obsolete, if not frowned upon. And though the traditional hierarchy elevated trainees with the intellectual and emotional fortitude necessary for managing acute and evolving illness, Dr. S observed another kind of social capital was emerging. In the new order, high status was given to people who spoke out about the ways in which the demands of residency, such as high caps on admissions or long call durations, were not simply exhausting, but unjust or harmful. A long call pilot program that had been highly rated by a previous residency class, for instance, was nixed when residents suggested it would lead to self-harm. And while most trainees were striving for excellence, a vocal minority could set the tone and shape perceptions for the majority. Each class had a group chat, and according to Dr. S, once a grievance was expressed in the group, consensus about its potentially traumatizing effects quickly solidified. Such framing, with its moral overtones, was a successful strategy. Dr. S's own authority dissolved in the face of it. It becomes unconscionable not to comply, Dr. S told me. Then you are oppressing them. So to be clear, sometimes grievance carries moral authority because it should. Medicine has long perpetrated racism and misogyny, for instance, and recognition of the immorality of the structures and people perpetuating such harms is long overdue. But when every ill feeling is labeled a threat to well-being or a trauma, distinguishing among harms of varying magnitudes becomes difficult, as does targeting interventions to our root problems. Experiencing daily racism, for instance, is not the same as being asked by your patients if you're old enough to be a doctor. Having to admit a new patient at the end of a shift is not moral injury, and burnout is not the same as depression. The substantial proportion of students and trainees and faculty who have debilitating mental illness need adequate care, but we cannot help them, much less address our structural inadequacies, if differentiating between serious illness and the inevitable challenges of training is treated as a moral breach. This risk of inciting moral outrage by discussing these topics with an attempt at nuance really hit home for me personally after one of the podcast episodes that we did called Tough Love. It was a conversation between me and a former Vice Dean of Education, Amy Holthauser, who was one of the few people willing to go on the record and talk about some of these challenges from the perspective of an educator. And though many people in educational roles, who I now think of as the over 35 crowd, told me it was their favorite episode of the season, in private, of course, people went bananas on Twitter and then on TikTok, completely incensed that the New England Journal of Medicine could have published a conversation that was, as they perceived it, so anti-well-being. And the reaction had all the innuendo that makes it really hard to talk about these topics in the first place. That we didn't care about trainee mental health, that discomfort is just a euphemism for abuse, and that I specifically have no credibility because I've never been on 24-hour call, which at least made me laugh. But even though these social media pylons, when they're directed at you, are obviously not fun, in so many ways, the reaction was entirely predictable. Social media reward the angriest and most aggrieved. And as soon as someone or a group of people claim victimhood, to offer any alternative perspective, or worse, deny people their pain, is not just to be wrong, it is to be evil. And because of that, it's become very difficult to ask some of the essential questions at the heart of these clashing values. what does well-being even mean in the context of physicianhood? And is there a conceptualization of well-being that allows for the necessity of struggle, the inevitability of failure, the hard work required for mastery? Though struggle has long been baked into our professional lives, as technology enables even more ease, the absence of friction, of struggle, has become an increasingly coveted state in our society more broadly. So I've recently become a huge fangirl of a writer named Kyla Scanlon, who is a 28-year-old from West Kentucky who writes about economics. And I really can't recommend her Substack more highly for those of you who do Substack. And in one of her posts, Scanlon argues that although for some time the most valuable commodity in our highly digitized universe was attention, in what she refers to as the, quote, simulation economy, the most valuable commodity has instead become the absence of friction. And now I'm going to quote her. It's not just about keeping you glued to the screen anymore, Scanlon writes. It's about convincing you that any sort of real-world effort is unnecessary, that friction itself is obsolete. The simulation doesn't just occupy your attention. Instead, it replaces the very notion that engagement should require effort. So what does this frictionless ideal mean for our professionalization? I'm just going to give you one example because it's been on my mind recently, and that's the use of Epic Chat, which I'm sure many of you already know about. But essentially, it's a texting function within Epic that allows doctors, nurses, trainees, basically any healthcare workers to text within Epic all day long, essentially. And because I left an institution that had Epic but didn't have the chat function and then moved to one that has Epic Chat, I have been totally fascinated by the way this little tweak in Epic can shape behavior. And so I've been asking everyone I know if they've observed the same. So one of my friends who works at a different hospital, who's an ED doctor, told me how since they got Epic Chat, it's been so much harder to get consultants to come down to the ED to actually see the patients. Basically what happens is a consult request is put in. The consultant may respond to the request over chat, ask for some pictures if it's relevant, and then give some recommendations over chat. Doesn't sound ideal, but I can tell you when I'm in the consultant role, I can completely imagine myself doing exactly the same thing. Why wouldn't I? Because everyone else is doing it. It's easier. It's frictionless. But is it good for our patients? And equally importantly, is it good for us? I think the pursuit of a frictionless life is just one example of a much broader societal conceptualization of well-being that may be antithetical to some of our core professional tenets. And one of the people who's best articulated this is the psychologist Lisa D'Amour. In an interview she did with the New York Times' Ezra Klein, D'Amour discussed how psychological distress and mental health concerns often get conflated. And what D'Amour argues is it's actually the inverse that is true. That much of the time, the presence of distress, the experience of distress, is actually a sign of mental health. And what I mean by that, and now I'm going to quote her, is that there are lots of circumstances in daily life where we fully expect to see distress. Of course, the same is probably even more true in medicine. There are endless moments in training and beyond that don't feel good, that can't feel good. So how do you endure these difficult moments when there are voices all around you insisting first and foremost that you take care of yourself? This was precisely the internal battle faced by Dr. A, the resident former medical student who I told you about earlier, whose peers told him not to do scut work. When I asked Dr. A what motivated him to do the work that his classmates seemed to consider beneath them, he said that these tasks both unambiguously advanced patient care and also helped him understand the dysfunctions of a system that he hoped to improve. But he also understood his peers' hesitance as they witnessed an exploitative and transactional system crushing workers. He told me, a quote, globally perceived narrative is reinforced. If they don't set limits, the system will crush them too. I have always been obsessed with the role of narrative in our lives. Our experiences, of course, shape the stories that we tell, but the stories that we tell ourselves also shape us. And so I think we have to ask, must this globally perceived narrative, the one insisting we protect ourselves from a system that's crushing us, be the only narrative that defines us? Of course, this story, that of our soul-crushing narrative, gets told in a variety of ways, but I think it was really well captured in a viral New York Times Magazine piece published a couple years ago called The Moral Crisis of America's Doctors. In it, the writer A.L. Press describes how so many physicians and trainees are no longer just burned out, we are morally injured. And what moral injury captures that burnout doesn't is the distress that physicians experience when the system prevents them from doing their jobs well. And this is a distress that no amount of resilience or yoga or pizza parties or muffins can fix. And though Press talked to a lot of doctors, he actually devotes considerable attention to trainees who, he writes, aren't merely contemplating how to resist, but are mulling whether the sacrifices and compromises are even worth it. I think moral injury as a term has an important role in medicine. By capturing the distress that physicians and trainees feel when the system keeps them from giving patients needed care, it names our pain. By acknowledging how the profit motive compromises care and exploits clinicians' goodwill, it identifies a cause. And by implicitly saying, it's not your fault, it soothes our wounds. But if the resonance of moral injury lies in its recognition of the systemic factors destroying individuals, what it can't tell us is how individuals can help improve the system. Press's article on physician moral injury features an emergency medicine physician disillusioned by the ways our system is failing patients. Because of cost-cutting measures, the physician finds himself one frigid night as the lone doctor in a busy emergency room when a woman with mental illness, frequent ED visits, and previously disruptive behavior arrives. Worried that she'll distract the staff from the other patients, the physician determines that she isn't suicidal, and as she becomes combative, he wheels her out of the ED and leaves her outside in the cold, frigid night. He's later haunted by his behavior, knowing that his former idealistic self would be horrified. And Press doesn't try to absolve the physician as he describes moral injury's manifestations. But my own interpretation is that this anecdote highlights the trap that arises if we let this narrative define us. In other words, when do the system's failures become our own? My mother, who hadn't planned on becoming a doctor, decided to go to medical school during the Vietnam War. The atrocities being committed left her feeling helpless, and medicine promised a concrete way to improve some people's lives, even if she couldn't comprehend how to help the world at large. Many generations have similarly perceived the world to be falling apart. What seems specific to this moment is the erosion of the belief that physicians can make the world better simply by caring for the person in front of us. If part of our professionalization requires developing that critical sense of agency, the moral injury narrative risks creating a sort of catch-22. We must acknowledge the structural forces constraining clinicians if we're going to inspire systemic change, but fully embracing this narrative may obscure our own agency, convincing us that we're these hapless victims of a corrupt system. That sense of disempowerment in its own right is bad for well-being, and of course it can be bad for patient care too. Because if you constantly tell yourself that the system is making it impossible to do your job well, it becomes more difficult in all the moments that we're pushed to distinguish systemic problems from the many ways medicine is, and always will be, really hard. So can we change the narrative? Is there a story that leaves room for the possibility that medicine may still be, at least sometimes, worthy of our worship. My grandfather was a physician writer who believed quite literally that transmitting stories across generations could fix medicine's problems. After practicing rheumatology for 50 years, he wrote a best-selling memoir about his own experience with illness. Soon after, Disney made the movie The Doctor, starring William Hurt, based on his book. But despite that success, about 15 years later, when he was in his late 80s and I got into medical school, my grandfather decided that he wasn't done. The memoir, published in 1988, had raised many problems, chief among them medicine's commercialization. Now he wanted to fix them. So despite his advanced Parkinson's disease and some associated dementia, he began writing another book, intended to be an exchange of letters between him and me that would somehow restore the sanctity of the profession. That I never wrote my half didn't seem to faze him. Initially, the letters and stories he sent me were full of wisdom. He told me I must always strive to be worthy of the title doctor, that I'd had to learn to live with the mistakes that I would certainly make. The patients didn't expect me to play God, but instead to be present with them when I couldn't. Yet as his mind unraveled, so did the stories. They lacked a coherent theme, a path forward, actual solutions to the problems that he'd observed. The early letters would pop up again 70 pages later. The patients who taught him critical lessons all started having the same name, so I couldn't keep them straight. And so often the story ended up just being a joke that he'd heard at his assisted living facility at lunch. But his conviction that medicine would be saved if he could just pass down the right stories was nevertheless unwavering. And so for 7 years, my medical educations unfolded in parallel. In one, I learned how to diagnose and treat disease. And in another, I became complicit in his delusion. The last time I visited my grandfather was shortly before I finished my own residency, just shy of his 94th birthday. I knew he wasn't doing well, but somehow I still expected our usual routine. I'd kneel at the base of his motorized chair, and he'd take my hands, ask me when I would be coming home again, ask whether we had anything in press, and then tell me he just remembered that he had another story that he needed to tell me stat. But this time I could barely wake him. His limbs, typically consumed by Parkinsonian motion, were unusually still. The blue cardigan he'd worn every day that I could remember had been replaced by a sweatsuit, free of his usual crumbs because he'd stopped eating. And so I took his hand and I kissed his forehead, and I told him that I'd come to Oregon from Boston to see him, that I missed him, that I was ready to work. And when he barely stirred, I said, "Don't you have another story to tell me?" And he said, "I finished my half." I doubt that I'm ever going to write my half of the book. The conceit has always felt a little trite to me. I still obviously cannot find any emotional distance, and I have no idea how to actually fix medicine. But as we struggle to redefine professionalism at a time when we face so many headwinds that seem utterly beyond our control, it's become clear to me that my grandfather's last act, his insistence that I carry this sense of sanctity as I too entered this privileged profession, was an act of defiance in its own right, a recognition of his own agency, a belief in a better story. And so I think all trainees deserve the same, to be guided by those who believe that medicine, despite its many warts, is still sacred, and to see in them the possibility of making medicine better. That sense of possibility, of hope, is critical, not just to well-being, but to preserving the many joys that remain. Thank you.
Mai Pham from Institute for Exceptional Care, and I cannot thank you enough. That was just a beautiful way to start the day and the conversation. This is more of a share and an ask for you to react. I'll start with saying there's an important group of people who are not in the epic chats, and that's patients. And you made me remember, this interplay between the system and who gets to define the system and who thinks they're in the system versus outside the system reminded me of what I told my partner was one of my best days as a clinician when I was post-call, very tired and determined to go on a date with my husband to Central Park, and instead had this nagging, draggy sensation in the back of my head that the 34-year-old mother of twins that I had just diagnosed with breast cancer 4 weeks ago still didn't have a breast surgery appointment because she was on Medicaid. And so on our way to Central Park, back then there were still payphones, I spent half an hour at a payphone dialing 4 women surgeons because I thought there was a higher chance. And I finally got through to one. It was a Saturday. And she said yes. My burden dropped, and I could actually be with my husband on our date. So it speaks to so many of the things that you talked about. But coming back to Epic Chat, maybe one way forward here is to re-inject that patient and challenge the trainees about what is their relationship to that patient, and that patient may often view them as a part of the system. And what is their agency in managing and manipulating that system on behalf of patients? Is that the intrinsic motivation?
Yeah. Am I supposed to respond?
You can if you would like to.
Well, no, it's such a beautiful story, and I think you're right. Like, it gets at this question of, when the system is failing, and the system is failing, will continue to fail, what is our own responsibility? And I think hearing you tell the story, I don't know what you felt like in the moment, but I'm sure that ultimately, like, your kind of extended sense of well-being was better for having done it, as was hers. And I think that, I brought up the Epic Chat thing, first of all, because it so clearly showed me how, like, my own behavior could change so quickly as a culture just changed, and that it really had nothing to do about capitalism or, like, our corporate forces. It's just literally being a human on the earth who responds to society, like whatever's happening around you. And so I think that's really important, just to remember not just that we have this power, we always have more power, but that it feels really good to use it.
And I'll take liberty. Can I say a word?
Please.
Your comment, thank you so much for sharing, reminds me of sort of this tension that I feel around professionalism is, for a new pharmaceutical agent that comes out, we measure it in terms of survival and patient benefit. But somehow with professional, we measure it in terms of behavior of the people who are administering it, not the people who are receiving it. And so I think it's an important reminder that the ultimate view of professionalism is how patients, how it affects patients in a certain way. Who's got the microphones? Yep. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. So I am wrapping up residency, and I have 2 callings. I'm a mom, and I'm a resident. And I think I really like what you said about the living in friction, because that's been my life, having those 2 things, where everything I do when I stay late for a patient means that I'm not there for my kids, and always trying to balance that. But I think because I understand that friction, it makes me a better doctor, because all the patients that are in the hospital bed are also dealing with that friction. So I do think that it is important for trainees to try to lean into that friction, because we're not the only ones that are struggling or have hard times or have other obligations. So I just wanted to echo that living in that world of friction can often give you that sense of agency and help you understand your patients better. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Lisa, I just wanted to thank you for a master class in how to talk about complex challenging topics in ways that are so human and so rigorous. So just deepest appreciation for that, first of all. And as a leader of an organization whose name is Well-Being and Equity in the World, now both apparently third rail words, one of the things that we've really leaned into, I just want to echo like that generative tensions is what we call those frictionless places where it's so easy to have easy solutions, and there are no easy solutions. In fact, the system is designed to achieve the results it's getting, which are results that are terrible for patients, for communities, and for all of the people. And so the other way our organization comes to be is this idea of we in the world. And in this context, how might we, as we think about this work of professionalism, find more courageous, more rigorous ways of holding the we, where we use our courage and privilege to challenge and call the system for what it is, as a system that isn't serving us and needs fundamental redesign, even as we hold the expectation of what it means to do that with love and rigor and fairness toward everyone involved, so that it's not a pull between generations as much a we of coming together to be honest in addressing these issues. And the last thing I wanted to say, just appreciated how much your stories, and Jess, you're calling it a figgy. I think things like fear, greed, love, justice, we tend to overcomplicate things. And yet, I think that the way you and your grandfather talked about getting to the core of what are we really talking about and what does it mean to have a system that's built on healing and love and trust? Like, do we have the courage to even imagine what that looks like? And then the discipline to build it. And I think like those are the things I know we're really thinking about. And I want to thank you and welcome any other thoughts you have.
And Lisa, before Lisa answers it, Shoma, can you just introduce yourself, and I ask all the speakers to say your name so we get to know each other?
Sure. Shoma Shah, President and CEO, We in the World.
Well, I guess I'm struck by how you started out by talking about sort of the use of these words, and then brought it back to sort of some of like the rawness of emotion, which is sort of where I live, whether I want to or not, my whole life. And I think that, when we gather at something like this, there is like we're all sort of trained to think in terms of like solutions and being pragmatic and having some deliverable that comes out of this. And I guess what I've always taken away from what happened to me with my own grandfather, and why I really meant this when I said this at the end, is that trainees deserve to have something like that, where like there's somebody at their side who also feels with them, like feels it all, and that's not something that we can like winnow down to some bullet points or anything like that. It's something that we have to model for them, and also like do it with them. Figure out who they are as individuals, and like how they can be the best professional they can be within who they are and their own constraints. And I think that's maybe the most important thing that I learned from my grandfather, but just believing in them. Like, we have so much talent. We are so lucky to interface with that talent so much, with people who choose to do this, who still choose to do this despite the many headwinds that our profession faces. And so I think we have this obligation, when you say we, to just choose some of the trainees among us, or maybe it comes with our patients, and just like feel all the things that they're feeling and not worry about how pragmatic we're being about it.
Hey, Lisa, that was absolutely spectacular. Joe Shapiro, Harvard Medical School, amazing. And what I want to do is highlight for me how that resonates. And that is, what you did was you called out the tensions. And I think sometimes that's the most important thing to do. Looking at these issues of well-being, of professionalism, not as problems to solve, but as tensions to wrestle with, to balance, right? And that can be enough. Because a lot of these aren't solvable, certainly with easy solutions, but they are addressable, if you will. And I wanted to relate that to the work that I do around peer support, which is where we're training fellow frontline clinicians to be able to sit with our colleagues when they are in a moment of pain. And those moments of pain are going to be there, even if we had the best systems in the world, which is we're going to see awful things that happen to patients. We may even be have unwittingly harmed them. These are painful things that can happen in our careers. And peers are now, what we're doing is training peers to sit with them, having been there, and just like you said, sort of be heard and to be felt and to see that these are hard things. And so when I teach about peer support, one of the things I say is, we're not trying to tell people not to feel. Like, yeah, if you harm somebody, you're going to feel shame and guilt and fear, and those are normal human emotions, and you feel them because you care. And I think this idea of letting people say it's okay to be vulnerable, it is okay to feel pain, but what we'd like to do is to have the culture and programs set up so that that pain doesn't crush you. And I think that it's a really good metaphor that you have for even this work that we're doing today is, and that, Jess talked about is not to give in to the hopelessness, because sometimes just calling it out and wrestling with it together will lead to small solutions, or even just the sigh of relief of having people say that, yeah, that's my experience too, and what can I do to make it better?
Dawn Johnson, president of DHT Services. I loved what you said, and I'm a nurse, and I felt that the same thing is going on in nursing. So they have some colleagues in the field that are feeling that same stress. And I'm a mom of 2 daughters who are in this generation that feel the world is heavy. And I think we have to accept our responsibility in making the world full of cushions for them. And we give participation awards. And so when they progress into medicine and feel like it's hard, we have to accept our responsibility of making life very easy. And I think the thing that you said that really resonated with me is only the positive feedback. It's tough to have a conversation with a family about something very negative if you've never had a negative conversation.
Right.
So I love what you said, because Epic Chat needs to involve families. You can't make a consult if you never look at the person, because that's full of bias.
Thank you. Great presentation. Safwan Badr, I'm Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. The intrinsic conflict that we have here is that there's a sublime idea of professionalism and all the values that comes with it. And as I relate to our trainees and junior physicians, I'm unable to have that bridge over troubled water. On one hand, we talk about it. On the other hand, there is medicine as a commodity in crushing debt. I'm interested in your thoughts of how we can bridge that divide and have a one conversation about this issue in face of all the very transactional and pressing challenges that they're facing.
I mean, I can only tell you what I do, which is every moment that I feel myself not upholding my responsibility, I ask myself why it's happening. Is it because everything is too transactional? Is it because the CEO of my hospital is somehow limiting my ability to do a good job? Or is it just me? And most of the time, it's just me. And I think that we need to learn and we need to teach our trainees also how to have those inner monologues, or dialogue, I guess. Because I do think that this story is powerful. Yeah, it's pretty transactional out there, but there's still a lot of good medicine to be practiced. There's still so much we can do for people. And there are still people who are terrified. And this is the one moment of their lives that they're the most vulnerable. And they will always need a human, no matter what happens with our technology, to sort of help them navigate that moment. And I don't think that's ever going to change. And I don't think capitalism can ruin that.
I think we have time for at least one more question. Yeah.
So weird not to touch it. Andrew Anderson, I'm the immediate past chair of the American Board of Family Medicine and faculty at George Washington University. On my way here to the conference, I happened to be sitting next to a medical student on the plane who was flying out for an AI that she was doing. And as I was reading over the articles, we struck up a conversation about that weaponization of the word calling. Is it a calling versus a job? And I was curious to see what she thought about it. And she said a lot of the same things that you said about generational divide and that word being weaponized, which was surprising to me as well, like as it was to you. And my question to you is, do you feel that that word is redeemable, or is it so maligned that it needs to be thrown out and a whole new concept thought of? I mean, for me, it's such a positive thing. It's a positive reminder, even in the hard times, that this is something that we're called to do. But I'm wondering if that still can go on with the current generation.
I do think it's redeemable. I mean, I don't want to make this into something trivial, but in the same way that, trends come and go, whether we're talking about jeans or how people wear their hair or whatever, things come back. So I think that's true with words as well. But I think it's the concept that matters, of course, whether or not we end up calling it a calling. And I think that's why I got so fixated on this idea of belief and worship, because I really do think that humans cannot exist without a belief system, without something that they find sacred. And I think the wellness thing is going to tire out. And the reason is, first of all, because capitalism is inextricable from wellness at this point too, and people are going to catch on to that. So the same people who hold well-being up here but also hate capitalism are going to have to reckon with that tension. But I also think that people are sort of starting to find wellness tiresome. And I think as AI enters our lives and the absence of friction becomes more prevalent, I think humans are going to actually find it rewarding to be challenged, to think, to believe, to feel. So yeah, I think it's redeemable, even if we have to call it something else.
One final question for you. You're a national correspondent for the New England Journal of Medicine. You're a broad thinker about medicine. What else should we be thinking about? What is the New England Journal not doing that you want them to talk?
Oh gosh, that's going to be the end of me, right?
It's just friends here.
I'm obsessed with primary care right now because I'm writing about it. So if anybody wants to tell me how to fix primary care, I'm all ears. And also why we haven't fixed primary care. I think this is so self-serving to say this, but I just don't think we do a good job in medicine thinking about culture. And that this is such a topic where we are confronted with the culture at large. And I think part of what we're seeing with the breakdown of trust and what's going on with science and what's going on in government is that we in medicine have not paid enough attention to how humans function in their world. So that's not the New England Journal's fault at all. But I think as a community, as a profession, I think we are being confronted with that imperative that there's more to our professional obligation than generating a bunch of evidence and creating a set of guidelines. That's not going to cut it anymore. So it's time for the next frontier, which I think will have to involve a lot of sociology and psychology and feelings.
Feelings, yeah. What an important challenge you've left us with. Please join me in thanking Dr. Reimagining.